write something on the chat room so that I know that you can listen to my voice. Okay, thank you. Okay, so let us start our lecture. So today we'll talk about the logic of scientific inferences, and it is the foundation for the quantitative research design. So last time we talked about qualitative research design. So at the first lecture, we talked about the wheel of scientific research, that means the knowledge accumulation. It involves two separate stages. One is the inductive research, which is mostly done by the qualitative research. And then we will come across the deductive research stage. And this is basically about quantitative research design. And when we talk about quantitative research design, and it is a deductive reasoning, so we need to study, or we need to discuss the so-called the logic of scientific inferences. So beginning to talk about the deductive logic, and there are several terms we need to understand. The first one is theoretical statements. So what are theoretical statements? Actually, theoretical statements are the components of a theory. So a theory is a system of interrelated set of theoretical statements. Okay. For example, in sociology, there's a well-known theories talking about so-called the status attainment model. Okay. And actually, you will do an exercise on that, the status attainment model. What is status attainment model? Status attainment model is that how does a person, an individual, get is status, socioeconomic status. So normally we known as SES, socioeconomic status, which is comprised of three elements. One's occupation, one's educational level, and income. So occupation, basically they try to measure it in terms of prestige. Occupational prestige, for example, teachers may have very good occupational prestige, but comparing to say construction workers, his or her income may be lower. So in this case, one's socioeconomic status actually comprised of three elements: occupational prestige, educational level, and income. So in this status attainment model, they try to argue that one's socioeconomic status, that means this is a kind of status, is actually affected by their parents' education. So in this case, that means there may be something related to how one get his or her status later on. It all depends on their parents. For example, if their father education level is high, then maybe the kids educational level will be high too. So, and if their parents, if their fathers have a very good occupation, then it may affect his or her, his son or daughter, something like that. So this is about the status attainment model. So in this case, maybe we have a number of statements, theoretical statements, making this kind of status attainment model. For example, we can have father education. So this is father education. And then we have another variable, mother education, okay? Mother education, father education, maybe they all affect the respondent educational level. So in this case, at least we have, in this case, we have two theoretical statements. So when we try to combine it together, that means mother's education affect one's educational level, and then father's educational level also affect the respondent's educational level. Graphically speaking, and so that means we have one variable, that is father education, and then we have mother education, And then this is the respondent educational level. And in this case, so that means this is father education level affect respondent educational level. So this is father education. This is father educational level. And this is mother educational level. And this is the respondent educational level. So from this simple graph, we can see that actually there it's involved in this theory. It is not the whole story of the theory state attainment model. In one of the tutorial, you will do it. So in this case, father educational level affect respondent educational level, and mother educational level affect respondent educational level. In this case, we have two theoretical statements, and we can call this the whole stuff a theory. Okay, so this is what it's about. A theory is a system of interrelated set of theoretical statements, and in this case, we have causal theoretical statement. Causal theoretical statement, that means it is a causal relationship. So instead of just a line, we should put an arrow in it. Arrow, that means the father educational level affect respondent educational level. Mother educational level affect respondent's educational level. So this is a kind of causal theoretical statement. Okay, so that means this is about cause and effect, and the cause is known as RE. That means respondent's educational level. The respondent, you ask people something like that. Okay, so and two conceptual variable, that means the cause is known as independent variable. The outcome is the dependent variable. So in this case, father educational level is the cause. So this is independent variable. We respondents, RE, respondents educational level is the outcome. So this is the DV, dependent variable. Right? And one independent variable affect cause the dependent variable. We call it causal theoretical statement. But we have another type of theoretical statement, which is known as correlational theoretical statement. That means there are some connection between variables, but they are not causal. So we call it correlated theoretical statement. For example, father's educational level is correlated with mother educational level. So in this case, we cannot say that your father's educational level affect your mother's educational level. It's a little bit awkward, right? Or your mother's educational level affect your father's educational level. It's also, again, very awkward. But we notice that father education and mother's education are somehow related in the sense just like some kind of marriage. Like-minded people, similar profile people may have higher chance to get married. Okay, so in this case, that means they are correlated, they're interrelated. So we call this correlational theoretical statement. Graphically speaking, there should be a line. So we use an and, double arrowed, to indicate their relationship is a kind of correlational relationship, not causal, but correlational. That means they are related, but not causal relationship. So in this case, this is the whole theory, also simplified version. So that means father educational level actually affect respondent educational level. Mother educational level also affect respondent's educational level. And somehow father educational level is correlated with that of the mothers. Okay, so that means in this case, we have three theoretical statements in this field, in this simplified stated attainment theory. That means this one line, every line is a theoretical statement. We have three lines. This is correlational, 1, 2, 3. Okay. So this is the theoretical statement. To begin with, for every theoretical segment, we have concept. That means IV and DV. And actually, we can have theoretical concept, for example, father educational level or mother educational level, respondents educational level. But this concept cannot be directly tested. Why? Because these are only mental images that correspond to the real object in the world. For example, what is education? So this is the kind of concept. But can you observe people's education? So in this case, that means these are only mental images. What does it mean? So I give you an example. For example, we have the concept of tree. Okay, we have a concept of tree. Just imagine that. Just maybe you pick out a piece of paper and draw a tree. Once you draw a tree, does it resemble any real tree in the world? Probably not. Okay, for example, I draw you a tree here. I draw you a tree. So this is a tree. Okay, so this is a tree. Can you find out this tree in the real world? Of course not. But this is my concept. Because I draw it quite actually. Okay, but when you look at this tree, you recognize this is a tree. How come? Because somehow you also have a kind of a mental image of a tree in your brain, and you once recognize it, and you can correspond to the real tree in the world. Okay, so in this case, concept is something in your mind that does not refer to any real object in the real world. So what are the real trees? If you look at here, so you can see all these are real trees. All these are real trees, but none of them resemble one another. There may be some minor differences or even big differences between the real trees, but somehow in our mind, our concept of tree actually make us recognize all of them are trees. So in this case, that is the concept. So concept is something abstract. Okay. What does it mean? Responsible. RE, I mean, in this case, it is a short form, right? So this is a short form. When we talk about RE last time, that is respondents educational level. Respondents referring to R and E referring to the educational level. So that is the somehow when we try to draw some figures or what we call theoretical framework, we use short form instead of the whole word. Okay. So in this case, when we talk about the concept or the nominal definition, that is actually a kind of mental image. And we try to elaborate what happened in our brain to others. And it is to avoid confusion. That is a working conceptual definition. And it is necessary to formulate any kind of theoretical statement. So this is developed before testing the theory. And the concept, as I mentioned, they are in our mind, in our brain. They cannot be directly observed. That means they are not directly observable. Okay, just like tree. Okay, so for example, last time we talked about educational level. So educational level. So what is education? Okay, so this is in our mind. Somehow we know it. So once we need to give some definition of education. So that is the conceptual definition. So how can you get the conceptual definition of education? For example, you can simply Google it, okay? Once you Google it, so you can say something like this, education definition. So education, according to the dictionary, it is the process of receiving or giving systematic instruction, especially at a school or university, something like that, or an enlightening experience. So in this case, these are the conceptual definition. But you can notice that there are two definitions of education. So first of all, you need to determine which is your conceptual definition of education. So once you give it, that means it is to avoid confusion. So this is a working definition. So you don't know whether it's true or not, but anyway, in order to avoid confusion, to make other people understand what you meant by education, you need to give the definition. Just like here, maybe a person you have in mind the first definition, but other people may have the second definition as what they perceive. So in this case, in order to avoid confusion, to avoid misunderstanding, in your research, you need to tell people what do you mean by education. So this is why you need to give out the so-called nominal or conceptual definition in your research. Okay. Another thing is, once we have our concept, that is the something in abstract, something in our mind, but we need to make it observable and measurable. Because once we do our research, we want to measure, for example, how to measure my father's education and how to measure my mother's education and how to measure my education to see how my father's education, my mother's education affect my education. So in this case, I mean, we need to turn it into something measurable and observable. And the process of doing that is known as operationalization. Operationalization is the process turning the abstract concept into something which can be observed directly. So that is the process of operationalization. So in this case, how can we measure education after giving the definition, the theoretical definition or conceptual definition of education? So, for example, we use this, the first one, that means the process of receiving or giving systematic instruction, especially at school and university. So this is our conceptual definition of education. Then how can we measure it? We can have several ways to measure. First of all, we can measure it by asking people. So, for example, are you university students, something like that? So this is also a kind of questions you can ask it. Are you a university student? That means to see whether one received tertiary education or not. If they say yes, then the respondent received university education. If the respondent say no, then he or she doesn't. But this is not a good way to measure education because we just have two categories: with university education and without university education. Then maybe we can use another way to talk about how to measure education. For example, can you tell me the highest educational qualification? I mean, whether you got some certificate or not, you have. And then you give them answer. Oh, and then you give them some option like none, without any cert, primary education, secondary, and then, for example, AD, and then say university degree, and then postgraduate. Postgraduate, I mean master and PhD. So in this case, that means you can measure more precisely than the first question. Are you a university student? In this case, just with university education or without. This is just two categories. But if you ask the second question, can you tell me the highest educational qualification you have? Then you have several options for them to choose. Then you can measure the educational level more precisely. But there's also another way to talk about educational level. So in this case, I give you the third operationalization. How many years have you been in school? Whatever school you have, okay, including university. So in this case, for example, if you have kindergarten, then only 3 years. If you have finished your secondary school, then 6 plus 3, okay. If you drop out during the primary 5, then you have only 5 plus 3, something like that, okay. So you answer 3 years, 9 years, 8 years, something like that. For example, right now, how many years have you been in school? So you are year 2 students, so you have a 2-year, almost 2-year AD plus 6 years of secondary school, 6 years of primary school. So that's 12 plus 2 plus 3 years in kindergarten. Okay, so 50 years. Okay, so in this case, I mean, you can easily answer my question here. So the more years you are in school, that means you should have higher educational level. So this is 3 ways. In this case, we have 3 ways to measure the concept of education. So when you construct something like this, so this is the process of operationalization. And for each question here, this is your operational definition of education. Operational definition of education is that somehow you turn an abstract concept like education into something we can measure, we can observe. So this is your operational definition. Okay. So the empirical statement is that the empirical statement is an empirical statement has to be derived through logical deduction and operationalizing the abstract concept from a theoretical statement. So in this case, this is quite complicated, but pretty simple. So, for example, when we examine a theoretical statement like father educational level, cause, effect, and respondents educational level. Okay. So this is our theory, theoretical statement. But indeed, this is only in abstract form. We didn't measure it. So how can we measure it? So we turn to our operational definition. We ask a respondent, for example, question, how many years of your father were in school? So this is your operational definition of father's education. And then you ask the respondent, how many years were you in school? Okay, so this is the operational definition of the respondent educational level. And then you try to measure it to see whether there's a causal relationship between this. So in this case, so how many years of education of your fathers and how many years of education of the respondents? So this is the empirical statement. Empirical statement. Okay, difficult to write here. So this is the empirical statement. This is the theoretical statement. And this process, turning the theoretical statement into the empirical statement, is known as operationalization. Okay? So that is the process. So an empirical statement has to be divided through logical deduction and operationalizing the abstract concept from a theoretical statement. So that means they are logically related. The empirical statement here is logically derived from the theoretical statement here. And actually, educational level here is an abstract concept, and you try to use some question, for example, how many years of your father have been studying. So in this case, this is the operational definition, and this is known as the empirical statement. Okay, is that clear? So again, then we may have another question. How many empirical statements can be derived from a theoretical statement? Actually, as many as you can. Just as I show you, we can operationalize education at least in 3 ways. This 3 way. That means if you construct empirical statement, actually you can construct 3 separate theoretical statements with the same theoretical statement, 3 empirical statements with the same theoretical statement. So in that case, I mean, this theoretical statement, father educational level affect respondents' educational level. We can ask years of education. We can have another empirical statement saying that, are you a university student? Was your father a university student? And are you a university student? So in this case, this is the first operationalization. And then we may ask, what was your father, what was the highest educational level of your father? So this is educational qualification. And then what is your highest educational qualification? So this is the second operationalization process. So in this case, that means we can have three different empirical statements. They derived from the same theoretical statement. These three empirical statements actually referring to the same theoretical statement. Actually, you can divide more by asking different questions. Okay. So that means there can be an infinite number of empirical statements from a theoretical statement. So put it simply, that means we have a theoretical statement. And actually, we can divide a number of empirical statement from the theoretical statement. Okay, as many as you can. But normally in doing our social research, we don't need to construct so many. Okay, we construct one or two. Okay, because we try to choose the most appropriate, the most feasible empirical statement. Okay, so theoretical statement, as I mentioned before at the very beginning, theoretical statement is actually the two concepts, the empirical independent variable and dependent variable, or they are correlated. They are actually a kind of theory. Okay, they are theory. So theoretical statements are the component of a theory. Okay. So now we go back to the deductive logic. When we do some kind of deductive research, that means the quantitative research, we aim at theory testing. I will remind you once again, the wheel of scientific study. Yeah. So this is theory. Okay. We derive theory into some hypothesis. Okay. And we try to test it. Okay. Test it. And then we got the result. And the result may not be good enough. So that means after testing, this is hypothesis. After testing, we find out something wrong. So in this case, we try to do some qualitative research, we do some observation, we do some field work, we do some interviewing, and then we try to modify our theories. That means they are theory, but this is not true enough. Okay. So in this case, we modify the T pi, so the theory, and then to formulate new theory. So this is a new theory. After getting a new theory, we divide hypotheses and test them again. Okay, so this cycle go round and round. So this is the deductive process, and this is the inductive process. This is about the qualitative research. This is about the quantitative research. So in this case, that means when we have theory and we want to test it, first of all, we need to turn our theoretical statement into empirical statement. Once they are empirical statement, that means we can observe and measure it, and then we can test it. So we test it and see whether these empirical statements are true or not. If they are not true, then we can modify our theory. But how? How can we modify our theory? We go back to the field and observe, to interview, and then we can get some new idea and then formulate our theory and make them into a new theory, a modified theory, and then we test them again. Okay, so this is why we have the process of testing. So in this case, I'm trying to talk about the logic within this process, the testing process. So for example, let us call a theory A and one of its empirical consequences B. That means B is an empirical statement. Remember, we can have a lot of empirical statements. So I denote it by B1. B1 is a particular empirical statement. Okay. Under situation 1, the theory can divide B1. Situation B also divide B1. But in situation 1, we find out that B1 is false. For example, we discover that no matter how many years one's father have studied, this doesn't affect the years, the number of years the respondent have in school. Okay, so that means A B1 is false. By the logic of deduction, that means we can say that the theory is wrong. So this is A is false. But on the other hand, we find out that the empirical statement is true. What happened? According to the deduction, we cannot say A is correct. We can only say A is more credible. Remember, that is the deduction. If you try to remember, actually, in tutorial, you have to do it, okay? So if A, then B, what happened? B is true. Can we say that A is true or not? Can we say that A is also true? Of course. The answer is no. Okay. So in that case, this is the same. That means we can have a theory, and from this theoretical statement A, we can derive an empirical statement B1. But if we find that B1 is true, we cannot say A is true. But somehow it gives us some confidence. It gives us some credibility. Possibly A is correct. But try to imagine this case. If A then B, B is false. Can we say that A is false too? The answer is yes. By logic, by the deductive logic, if B1, the empirical statement, is false, we can say that the theory is false. Okay? So that means we cannot be certain if our empirical statement is true. We are not certain our theory is true, but only to make our theory more credible. Credible, that means believable. Okay? But we find out that the empirical statement is false, and we can reject the theory. So this is why we call it falsificationism. In deductive logic, our quantitative research aims at not confirming or demonstrating the truthfulness of a theory. What we do is try to falsify a theory, to prove a theory is wrong because of this kind of deductive logic. You get what I mean? So I state once again, in quantitative research, in deductive-oriented research, we are trying to reject theory, to prove theory to be wrong, to be false, instead of proving a theory is true, because it is impossible by the deductive logic. Okay? Yes. So in this case, remember, under situation 1, we can say that A is false because we find out that the empirical statement is false by the deductive logic. In situation 2, we find out that B1 is true. That means our empirical statement is true. But we cannot say our theory is true. But we can say A is more credible, more believable. Okay, so that is the logic. And try to make things more complicated. That is the credibility of theory. So in theory testing for any given empirical statement, there's not only one theory A is implying it, but also other theories C, D, E, F also. So why situation 2 cannot prove a theory is true. For example, when we have a so-called B1 is true, this kind of empirical statement, we can have another way to talk about the other theory to demonstrate B1 is true. Just right here. Our original theory is father education cause or affect respondents education. So this is our theory. So we try to measure how many years, for example, years of father in school. So this is empirical statement. See how it is affect with years years of respondents in school. Okay, so later on we'll talk more about empirical statement. Okay, so this is the empirical statement. Can you think of other theory to describe the same empirical statement? Years of father in school affect years of respondent in school. So in this case, we may think of other theories to talk about this, to divide here. Okay, so maybe we can say that this is not father education affect the respondent education. That means maybe we may say that for example, the richness, the wealth of your father affects respondents' wealth. So in this case, when a person is rich, then he or she can afford more schooling. Okay, so this is not just educational level, it's about wealth. So in this case, if you have a rich father, so that he can have many years in school, because your father's wealth affect your wealth. That means once you have more money, then you can have more years in school because you don't want to work. So that means the second theory you can also operationalize the second theory by using the same empirical statement. Okay, so in this case, once we find out that this empirical statement is true, we don't know whether the theory A here, this is theory A, and this is theory B. Which one is true? Because both of them imply the empirical statement. So this is the empirical statement. Okay, so this is why situation 2, once we find out that our empirical statement is true, we cannot certain A is true as well, because there may be other theories implying the same empirical statement. Okay, can you get it? Okay, so this is what happened. But we can sure if B1 is true, so this is implying, but also other theories, C, D, E, F, okay? Because there are other theories implying the same empirical statement. So our intuition tells us that strongly that we have tested the theory against the fact, and it has stood the test. But we can say and call the theory A more credible, even though we cannot verify its truth. So in this case, I mean, even though we are not sure, yes. So even though we are not so sure theory A is true, but we can have confidence about that. Okay. So in this case, let me state once again. Some of you may have difficulty understand it. When we have a theoretical statement A, we can derive an empirical statement B1 from the theory A, and we try to test the empirical statement. If the empirical statement is false, by logic, we can say that the theory A is wrong, is false. Okay. But if the empirical statement is true, by logic, we cannot say A is true because this is not the way logic works. So this is case A and B. B is true. We cannot say that A is true too. But we can, if B is false, then we can be certain A is false as well. Okay, so in your tutorial, go back to review the deductive logic idea. Okay. So I now getting this kind of idea. So we go to a more complicated situation. That is actually the real life situation here. The full model of theory testing. For example, we have theory A. This is theory A. This is what we want to test. Okay. Theory A, we can derive an empirical statement from theory A, B1. But we notice that by the same empirical statement, there may be other theory implying the same empirical statement B. Here, the empirical statement here, years of education of father in school affect years of education of the respondent. At least we can have theory A. This is what we want to test. Father education affect respondent's education. But there may be other theories, other theoretical statements implying the same empirical statement, like the wealth of your father affects respondent's wealth. Okay, so that means we may have other theories, C, E, Q, S, whatever, affected, implying the same empirical statement B. But there are other theories implying not B. That means there may be some theory talking about B, not B. So that means, for example, I have a theory that actually wealth and education are not important. Okay, and actually, in the world, I mean, education. For example, just a theory, education doesn't affect kids or maybe son and daughters, the children's well-being. Because the state, for example, the state take care of them. All education are free. Okay, all education are free up to say university level or even postgraduate level. For example, in Europe in the past, I don't know whether it is true, it is correct right now. For example, in Germany, even for college education, it is free. Okay, it is free in Germany in the past. I don't know right now. For example, in France as well. In France and Germany, you don't need to pay a damn. You don't need to pay $1 for your education. Okay, so in this case, that means education doesn't affect children's other people's education. That means your father or mother education won't affect your education because they are all free. So no matter education or wealth doesn't affect a respondent's years of education. It all depends on the respondent's intelligence, the respondent's competence, all these kind of things. So this is the theory. So that means in this case, there are some theory, for example, D and R imply not B. B should be false. So what do we find out? We find out B is true. We find out B is true. If we find out B is true, then that means A is more credible, believable. But also other theory as well, because other theories also imply B, like CEQS. Okay? CEQS. But if B is true, then we can reject D and R. Okay? So in this case, why? Because P is true, that means, but D and R imply not B. So this is wrong. So we can reject D and R. Can you get what I meant here? Okay. So that means this is the full model of theory testing. So how does it affect scientific knowledge accumulation? So just imagine something like here. For example, in the universe, there's a lot of theory explaining things. Okay, so we have an empirical statement here, an empirical statement here. Some of them imply the empirical statement is not true, not true. And some of them implying the empirical statement as true. And actually, we find out that the empirical statement is true. Then we can eliminate all these theories which imply the empirical statement as not true. Okay, that means the remaining theory will be smaller. The number of remaining theory will be smaller. And then we test another empirical statement. Another empirical statement say E1. And then we have use a different line. So in this case, B1, this portion of theory imply E1 as not true. And the remaining here implying the theory as true. Okay? And we find out that E1 is true. As a result, we can eliminate here. That means the number of remaining theory will become even smaller. And then we try to find out E3, E2, and other empirical statement. Okay? Again, there may be some remaining theory explained it as not true. And then the rest of it say that it is true. And we find out that E2 is true. That means we can eliminate here. So this is how scientific progress happens. Okay, by eliminating alternative theories. Alternative theories, that means once you have your own theory, the others are alternative theories. They may be equally true. But by testing more and more empirical statements, you can eliminate more and more alternative theory. And as a result, it makes your own theory more and more believable, more and more credible. You get the idea. Okay? So that is the whole model is about. Got it? So this is about logic, so a little bit difficult, but anyway, so you want me to summarize for you one more time because we still have a lot of slide here, but anyway, because this is important. So once again, let's try to summarize in a brief sentences. So we have theoretical statement. Theoretical statements are the components of theory. Theories is a set of interrelated theoretical statements. In theoretical statement, we have concept, the independent variable and the dependent variable in causal relationship. Or they can be correlated. That means variable can be correlated. Okay? But because these are concepts, they are only in our mind. They are abstract. Okay? So that means they cannot be directly observable and measurable. So in this case, we need to do something to make them observable and measurable. And this process, we call it operationalization. By operationalization, we turn the theoretical statement into empirical statement. Okay? The empirical statement also, that means turning the IV or variable into something observable and measurable. So we still call them dependent and independent variable, but they are now in terms of, say, question. If you do a survey. In experiment, it turned to be some other procedures, experimental procedures. For example, measuring responding time, you use a stopwatch to measure people's how fast they respond. Okay, respond time. Okay, so this is empirical statement. So you talk about your operational definition is how you measure the responding time using a stopwatch, something like that. So this is empirical statement. So that means empirical statements are derived from theories. But there's something interesting about theoretical statement and empirical statement. For any theoretical statement, you can derive infinite number of empirical statements depending how you operationalize them. Okay, so you can have empirical statement 1, empirical statement 2, empirical statement 3. Okay, by the same token, many theoretical statements may share the same empirical statement. I mean, they may, depending how you operationalize them, actually theoretical statement can have several theoretical statement implying it. Okay, okay, so this is how you do it. So in testing, we have to rely upon our deductive logic. Our deductive logic say that if A, then B. Then if we find out that B is true, we cannot say A is true. We cannot say that. But if B is false, we can say that A is false. In other words, if we find out that the empirical statement is false, then we can say that the theory is wrong. But if we find out that the empirical statement is true, we cannot say that the theory is true. We cannot say that. Okay? So the whole idea about scientific research, using quantitative research, using hypothesis testing is to prove a theory is wrong, to prove the theoretical statement is wrong. Okay? So we call it falsificationism. To falsify something rather than to prove something as true. And in actual process of scientific knowledge accumulation, we need to do a lot of testing. Why? Because, for example, here, if we find out that U1 is true, the theory is more credible, but we find out that a lot of empirical statements derived from the theoretical statement are also true. What happened? That means the theoretical statement of theory withstand a lot of tests. That means it makes the theoretical statement more and more credible. More and more credible. That means the more tests you use to examine the theoretical statement, and it demonstrated all these empirical statements are true. Then the theory, even though we cannot prove the theory is true, but we believe that the theory is very, very believable, more very credible. Okay? And another idea about this is that because E1, for example, E1, we have theory, say, this is our theory, and then we have theory 2, theory 3, theory 4, implying E1 too. Okay? So that means our theory is true, but also T2, T3, and T4. But for the empirical statement 2, T2 also implies E2. T3, theory 2 also implies empirical statement 2. But T4 doesn't. T4 implies E2 as false. But we find out that E2 is true. Then that means we can eliminate T4. There are only two competitors or two alternative theories that competing with our theory T. So we test the third time, empirical statement 3. For example, T2 implies empirical statement 3 as true, but T3 implies not true. Of course, our theory implies as true. And we find out that empirical statement 3 is true. Then we can eliminate T3 as well. You know what I mean? So in that case, I mean, by doing more testing, this is why, which make our theory more credible, more and more credible. If we test the theory a lot, different time, and different time give us the true value. That means all the empirical statements we test are true. It help us to make our theory more and more credible by eliminating alternative explanation, by eliminating alternative theories. Those theories are competing with our theory. Okay? So this is the whole logic of theory testing or hypothesis testing. Okay, got it? If you still cannot fully understand it, try to review the recording. Yeah, make sure I have recorded. Yeah, you can review the recording. I have repeated several times. So the conclusion of theory testing is the basic logical process of science is the elimination of alternative theories by investigating as many of the empirical implications of each theory. Okay, that means we need to derive many empirical statements and try to prove that that empirical statement as true, so to make our theory more and more credible. Why it can be more and more credible? Because we have eliminated a lot of alternative theories. So always trying for the greatest possible variety in the implication testing. Okay, the more different tests are performed, the theory withstand all these tests. That means all these empirical statements are shown to be true. Then there will be a lot of alternative theory which imply the opposite are eliminated. Okay, so this is why our theory, if our theory can withstand all the tests, it becomes more and more credible. Okay, so put it differently, through the universe of theoretical statement is infinite. That means we can have a lot of theory in the world. With more tests being performed, more theoretical statement of the universe will be eliminated, and the universe should be shrinking, just like here. It should be shrinking. So this is the universe of theory. By testing empirical statement 1, we can eliminate some of the alternative theory. Okay. By testing empirical statement 2, we can eliminate even further. For example, this is our theory. By testing empirical 3 statement, we can eliminate more. So as a result, the world is the so-called the universe of theoretical statement become smaller and smaller. That means we are coming to the truth, although we can never get it. Okay, so that is the idea. Okay, but we are coming closer and closer to the truth. Okay, so the analogy can be used from something right here. If we have a line here, and we divide the line every time into half, divide the line into half and eliminate half of it. So first of all, we can eliminate here, and then we can eliminate here. It's getting shorter and shorter. But can we get a point? It doesn't. For example, right here, we can eliminate here and here, finally here. But even for a point here, a point should be something spaceless. But we can still, if you use a telescope here to look at it, it's still a little bit like here. That means this is amplified using a telescope. That means we can still divide the small line into half. And we can never get into a point because it's infinity. Okay, so this is a kind of analogy of scientific progress. We are coming closer to the truth, but we can never get the exact one theory to explain everything. Okay, so that is the idea. So even though it is impossible, at least we can say that we are approaching to the truth when more and more tests are performed. Okay, so that is the whole idea about scientific inferences. So actually, these handouts are derived from a chapter from a very important book written by Alfred Steichkamp, and actually I download it for you, so you can, if you want to see the whole picture. So this is Steichkamp Constructing Social Theory, Chapter 2. So you can, if you want to understand more, you can read it. So you can see that actually I thought all the stuff here. Okay, all the stuff here. Okay. So any question about that, about the scientific inferences? I real life example, okay? The real life example, actually, I have already give one for you. For example, father education affect respondent education. So you believe that your father's education may affect your education. But in that case, wealth also too. If you have a rich father, that means he can get a lot of schooling, not directly because of his competence, education. Respondent well also get you more education. So actually, you can derive the same empirical statement from your father's, from wealth, instead of talents, for example, education talents, something like that. Okay. For example, this is theory A. For example, I change it. For example, that is the talents, okay, or intelligence, if you like. Your father intelligence affect respondent's intelligence because of genetic factors, biological reason. But your wealth of your father also affect respondent wealth. So these are two theories. But you can use the same empirical statement to represent these two theories. Okay, years of education of the father and years of education of the respondent. Actually, wealth can affect one's education. Intelligence also affect education. Okay, so in this case, the empirical statement can be implied by both theories. Okay, but we can have another one, that is the theory C. That is what? Public education, health, or public free education should be. Getting education. So in this case, if public free education help all citizens getting education, so this theory A, we can demonstrate empirical statement is wrong. Because no matter how rich or no matter how intelligent your father is, it won't affect your education because you can receive free education up to university level, just like France and Germany in the past. Okay, so in this case, if you find out that the empirical statement here is true, it is true, then you can eliminate theory C because theory 3 implies the empirical statement as not true. Okay, so you can eliminate theory C, but it makes theory A and B both more credible. Okay, you get what I meant? But if the empirical statement is false, if this is false, you test it. That means you just ask people questions and try to do some statistical analysis. Later on, you will do SPSS and to see whether they actually happen. Okay. So the empirical statement is that if your father have higher education, then you should have higher education. You just measure because empirical statement is about measurement, something like that. So you ask people, for example, here, I ask you some question, how many years you have studied. So you say 12, and how many your father have studied, say 10 or whatever. So you can measure it. Later on, we will tell you how to exactly test the hypothesis using SPSS to do some statistical analysis. Okay, so this is how we can get whether the empirical statement is true or not. Okay, so in this case, if the empirical statement here is false, that means theory A and B are also false. So the remaining theory C may be more credible. Okay, can you get the idea? So it all depends upon these kind of deductive logic. So make sure you know about the deductive logic. Okay. So any question about the scientific inferences? I think this is the most difficult part of this handout. Okay. If you still have questions, you can email me, okay? Or read the chapter here, okay? So you can, this is more detailed, okay? It explains a lot of things. So now we go to another part of the quantitative research. That is how to formulate a research question, okay? So in your assignment, one of the assignment is to write a research proposal, and the research proposal, for every research proposal, you start from a research question. So a research question has one or a small number of causal relationships. For example, what causes divorce? Causal relationship, remember at the very beginning, a causal relationship at least involves two variables, an independent variable and a dependent variable. But this question, what causes divorce? It's just a topic, it's okay. But what you lack is independent variable. What causes divorce? That means you have the dependent variable, divorce, but you don't have any independent variable. This is not a good research question because it does not specify any causal relationship. Because when we do testing, remember testing, we should have at least empirical statement involve at least two variables. Okay, that is the reason. So what you know from the question is what caused divorce is your dependent variable, the ultimate effect you want to explain. So how can you do it? So you can do your literature review. For example, you can go to the library, the e-library, and try to find out what happens. But the easiest way is to, if you're at home, so you can easily use Google Scholar. You use Google Scholar, you just type what caused divorce. So you can see that there are a lot of articles perceive the cause of divorce and analysis of interrelationship. There are a lot of things here. So how can you select what you want to review? That is the literature review. You want to look at past, previous study on that topic. So in this case, how can you identify the independent variable? So you can look at this. So in this case, you go to the importance of the article is cited by how many? So in this article, it is cited by 233. It's okay. But this book, 309. This one, 520. The more citation, that means that piece of literature is more important. Okay, so you can find whether there are a lot of 1,033. So this is very good. A longitudinal study of marital problem and subsequent divorces. But anyway, so in this case, you can take a look of it and try to find out what are the independent variables. For example, this is divorce research, what we know, what we need to know, something like that. So that is the sociological causes of divorce or historical and sociological of divorce. So in this case, through this kind of literature review, you can refine your research question. You start from a very simple question, what caused divorce? But this is not good enough because it's only specified the dependent variable. So how can we find out the independent variables? It's not just one independent variable, but many independent variables. So you can do your literature review. By doing literature review, you can refine your research question. Okay? So by thinking what possible causes are or searching relevant literature, you may find some causes of divorce. So by incorporating the possible causes, you may have the following better research question. Is age at marriage associated with divorce? That means the earlier you get married, the more likely you will get divorced later. Does ethnicity affect divorce? Do Chinese people are more likely to have divorce than, say, Indians? Something like that. Does ethnicity affect divorce? Or actually, a previous divorced person more likely to get divorced again? So in this case, that means we have three theoretical statement here about three independent variables. So if we graphically draw these three empirical statements, theoretical statement, so we can have something like this. The first one is age. The second one is ethnicity. The third one is whether it got previous divorce. Okay, all these affect our ultimate dependent variable. They are causal relationship, so we put an arrow here. They are all affecting whether one will divorce. So this is the ultimate dependent variable. So this is age, ethnicity, and whether the person have previous divorce experience. This all affect divorce. So maybe you this is your theory, which composed of three theoretical statements. Okay, and instead of just what caused divorce, this is a better research question you are asking. Okay, you want to examine three independent variables: age, ethnicity, and previous divorce experience, whether they affect your chances of getting divorced again or getting divorced in the future. So this is a better research question. So in this case, that means we have more complex research question involve more than one causal relationship or two variables. Okay, so we call this a kind of a theoretical framework. This is what you will do in research. So when you write your research proposal, always give us a graphical representation of your theoretical framework. So this is a kind of theoretical framework. So in this case, you have a research question, whether age, ethnicity, and previous divorce relationship affect one's divorce in future, okay? And then you need to justify why you want to do this research. That means how to justify the research question. There are two ways to justify research questions. The practical significance. That means after finding the result, it is very important for us to improve our world to solve some kind of real world problems. So practical significance is that you may try to find out some statistic about the divorce rate, for example, in Hong Kong. And you find out that the divorce rate in Hong Kong is rising. It's rising. So this is why you want to study what causes divorce. And it has practical significance if you want to reduce the divorce rate. Because divorce rate make a lot of broken family and it is not good for children, something like that. So you make some rationale, make some reason for doing your research in order to save the world, to solve some real world problem. So that is the practical significance. And actually, you can easily find out a lot of practical significance to justify your research, okay? And the second one is more difficult. That is the theoretical significance. Whether you study making a contribution within the framework of existing social scientific literature. That means whether you will improve the theory or we can fill up some so-called knowledge gap. Knowledge gap, that is, there's something missing and you want to fill in, bridge up that gap. Okay, so that is the knowledge gap, for example. And many people thinking that one's educational level is actually dependent upon wealth, okay, or depending on intelligence, okay. So that is the knowledge gap. Okay, someone wanted a break, so maybe we can take a 5 minutes break. Okay, after the 5 minutes break, we come back and we talk more about the research question. Okay, let's take a 5 minutes break. Okay, so the break is over. So we go back to our lecture. So the theoretical significance is about knowledge gap. So what is knowledge gap? For example, if you find out that some research, some previous research, okay, some previous research demonstrate that the empirical statement is true, but some other research also demonstrate that the empirical statement is false. That means some say it is false, some say that it is true. That means we cannot have a conclusive uh, 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 idea about the theory, whether the theory has to be rejected or has to be more credible. So in this case, you may want to do one more research to settle it. So this is a kind of knowledge gap. Okay. Another knowledge gap is that, for example, right here, we talk about the state attainment model, the simple one. So that means the mother education affecting once the respondent's education. But some people saying that in between, how far the education affect respondent education, there's something missing. They think that. So they think that if your father have a very high education, then they expect you to have high education as well. So something here, what we call expectation. Expectation. Okay. So in that case, that means if your father have higher education, then they your father will have higher expectation of you, and this expectation cause you to work harder so that you can get higher educational level. The same apply to mother education. If your mother has a higher education, she will expect you to have higher education. So this kind of expectation, and this expectation affect you to have higher education, inspire you, and actually encourage, motivate you to have higher education. So there's some variable missing in the original theory. So you introduce one more variable into it, what we call the intermediate variable. That means some variable in between. Okay, intermediate variable. So that means the ultimate dependent variables is the respondent's education. That is the ultimate in a dependent variable. And the ultimate independent variable is father education and mother education. They are correlated in a sense. They are correlated. But through some intermediate variable, intermediate variable, so-called expectation. So by introducing the intermediate variable, you try to improve the original status attainment model. So this is how you fill the so-called knowledge gap. Okay, so this is how you do it. For one thing, you can easily find out some practical significance of your research. And the second one is more difficult and sometimes not necessary, especially for policy study. So this is for theoretical significance. You try to fill some knowledge gap. Okay, so this is how you justify your research. So there are steps in formulating research question. Remember, formulating research question is not quite straightforward. It involves back and forth. Back and forth, that means it involves several steps for you to revise your research questions. So first of all, you select a topic. There's no formula for selecting a topic. The best guide is to conduct research on something that interests you. For example, you are interested in divorce. So you may ask the very first question, what causes divorce? Okay, so this is your topic. After selecting the topic, you try to find out a phenomenon or dependent variable you want to explain. That means you want to study marriage as the biggest topic, and then the marriage again, you want to study divorce. Okay, that is your ultimate dependent variables, and try to think of some possible independent variable. You can do it by just thinking about that, or you can do some literature review to find out the possible independent variables. Or sometimes you can find out some intermediate variable as well. Okay, so in this case, so you then you go to another step. If you cannot think of any independent variable, so directly search the literature to see what causes are attributed to your selected dependent variable. Okay. And the major difference between step 3 and step 4, the following is that the literature you got in step 3 is much more focused and specific than in step 4. That means in most different steps. So that means this is back and forth. Once you got the literature review and you think that this is still too big, and dig deeper into your literature and find out more precise, more narrowed focus. Okay, so during this process of literature review, you can and sometimes necessarily modify your research question with new insight or information. Okay, don't be still so stupid to regard your original research question as faultless and perfect. Let me, at the very beginning, you think of a research question or some research questions. But don't think that these are your final research questions, because you can always revise your research question after doing the research, literature review. Okay, and moreover, you need to narrow down your research question to a manageable scale and scope. What scale and scope? For example, you want to study the marriage relationship of Hong Kong people, but for the whole Hong Kong population, maybe it is not manageable for you. So you just narrow it down. Okay, narrow it down. For example, you want to study status attainment model, where the further education affect your educational level or respondent educational level. So at the very beginning, you want to do a whole research on the whole Hong Kong population, but then suddenly you find out that there may be differences between different cohorts. For example, the older people, younger people, and you focus on the younger people. That means you narrow down your research question to a narrower scope. Not all Hong Kong population, but the youngster. Okay, the youngster, say below 30s. So in this case, that is how you formulate your research questions to make it more and more specific. Okay, and it involves a back and forth process, not a straight line process, not a linear process. It always involves back and forth. You can always revise your research question. Okay, so in doing your research proposal, you can always discuss with your group mate. You can always try to find out more literature to refine your research question. Okay, and related to research question, actually we have several types of research we can do. The first one is exploratory. Exploratory research question is that is most likely related to qualitative research. Qualitative research, that means you just want to study something, but even for the dependent variable, you are not so sure what it is. Okay, for example, you want to study why we have the anti-governmental protests. So this is your topic, and you want to find out what happened. So this is exploratory study. You want to study why people join these kind of protests, but you have no idea about the independent variable. Even for the dependent variable, possibly you have some idea. That means they actually join the protest. But you can refine your even dependent variable. For example, the intensity of joining the protest. That means whether you join or not join. So this is a yes/no question, but you can refine it into some kind of intensity. To what extent, how many times, or whether you use some violent act during the process. So that is a sort of exploratory research. Okay, it's most likely related to qualitative research, because qualitative research, you have nothing in mind, or you have some big idea in mind, and you go into the field and interview people, doing some observation, doing some participant observation, and to see what happened. So that is exploratory study. The second types of research is descriptive research. Descriptive research, that means you are not trying to explain anything. You just want to describe it. Qualitative research can be descriptive. Okay, qualitative research, you try to describe people emotion involved in participating the protest. Okay, so this is a kind of descriptive research. You describe how they feel why they are so angry, why they were so angry and join the protests. Okay, so this is descriptive research. But for quantitative research, it can also be descriptive. For example, census. Census research is quantitative research. The government does census every 5 years, 10-year census, and then 5-year by census. Okay, these census research are actually quantitative research, but they are only descriptive, describe what happened to the whole Hong Kong population. So how age, how Hong Kong people getting aging, okay, or Hong Kong people, what is the average educational level of the Hong Kong population, something like that. So these are descriptive research. That means for both qualitative and quantitative research, they can be descriptive. Finally, we have explanatory research. Explanatory research, that means we want to explain something by testing hypotheses. Okay, so at the first part of this lecture, we talked about scientific inferences. All these are about explanatory research. We try to formulate a kind of theoretical framework. We draw a theoretical framework, for example, the status attainment model. We try to explain something to see how fathers and mothers' education affect one's educational level. Okay, and by putting so-called the intermediate variable, that means their expectation, we can explain in a more comprehensive way. Okay, so this is explanatory research. So the types of research question also reflect the types of research question you are formulating. For example, in exploratory research, what causes divorce may be sufficient, or what is divorce may be sufficient. Okay, so exploratory research, you want to explore to see what kind of variable involved in it. Okay, so it may not be explanatory, that is exploratory. Okay, descriptive research to say how many Hong Kong people getting divorced, so that is descriptive research. Explanatory, exactly, you want to study how age, ethnicity, and previous divorce experience explain divorce rate. So in this case, these are explanatory research. So at least we have these three kinds of research. And then we go to the literature review. It is essential for us to have literature review. First of all, that is to demonstrate a familiarity with a body of knowledge and establish credibility. For example, if you want to write a research proposal, you need to tell people that you are familiar with the literature, familiar with the study, so that they have confidence in your research. And in real life experience, for example, we write proposal. Actually, we write proposal for what? For money. We want some funder. We want some sponsor. Okay, so we need to convince them we are capable. So this is why you need to do the literature review. To do the literature review to demonstrate that you actually familiar with the studies. Okay, you know how other people think. You know what happened. You know the knowledge gap within it. So this is one of the goals, to convince others, to let other people give you money to do your research. Okay, and it also to show the path of prior research and how a current project is linked to it. So especially related to the so-called knowledge gap. So it shows how you try to improve the existing knowledge. Okay, by doing the literature review, you can identify the knowledge gap. You can identify what happened, what problems of previous research, and you want to modify them. You want to correct them. Okay, so this is actually to show the development and accumulation of knowledge. And the third one is to integrate and summarize what is known in an area, a review, put together and synthesize different results. Actually, from the literature review, it helps you to develop your own theoretical framework. That means the graph, the figures I dropped you earlier. For example, status attainment model. Okay, through the literature review, you can derive your own theoretical framework from it. And to demonstrate, to show people how you come up with this theoretical framework. Okay, your theoretical framework is not out of nothing. It's out of something. Out of your review of the literature, out of your review of previous study. Okay, so this is the continuity. Okay, and actually it also to learn from others to stimulate new ideas. So it tells procedures, technique, research design worth copying so that a researcher can better focus hypothesis and gain new insights. So not only for the theory, you also can reveal how people design the research to achieve it. So actually the research design, for example, you want to study so-called the status attainment model. And you notice that in the past, most study on this educational attainment rely upon survey. So in your research, you may also want to use survey. When you use survey, that means you need a questionnaire. So in previous study, they use certain questions to ask people concept. That means they use different way to operationalize education, all this kind of thing. So you can draw some insight or even copy their idea, okay? Given that you cite in your research proposal, okay? So in this case, that means not only for the theoretical framework you're working on, it also helps you to improve your research design. Do you want to use experiment? Do you want to use survey? For example, in previous study, you find out that those studies which rely on, say, experiment cannot get good result for the status attainment model. So in this case, you won't use experiment. Okay. So in this case, a good literature review can help you make a good theoretical framework, make a good research design, and make a good set of instruments for you to measure. That is the operationalization. Help you to do the operationalization. It also sharpen your research question. That means help you to conceptualize. For example, different study have different conceptualization of education. So you can pick up which concept you want to study. So that is the importance of literature review. So remember, in doing your research proposal, you have to do a literature review. At least, I forgot how many journals you need to read. That means in your research proposal, you need to include several academic journals, not just news, not just some introduction textbook. You need some journal articles. Okay, how do you find the journal article? I've already shown you. Using Google Scholar is one way. Another is using the database in UW eLibrary. Okay, they have a database. You just type the question you want, for example, the research question, and then they will give you some hints. So from research question to hypothesis, and hypothesis is the conjunction or guess or speculation about the causal relationship between two variables. So this is a tentative answer to your questions. So indeed, hints about hypotheses are embedded within a good research question. For example, your research question is about whether age, and this ethnicity and previous divorce relationship affect one's chances to get divorced in future. So in this case, this kind of research question has already identified the independent variable, three independent variable. So at least you have three hypotheses. Okay, so the more focus of your research question, the easier for you to have a hypothesis. Okay, so that is the how research question to hypothesis. Sometimes they are actually the same. Okay, so that is the one way to do to formulate your hypothesis. And then you should ask whether the covariation is positive or negative. That is the direct direction of causal relationship. So in this case, the hypothesis here is not enough. You need to show the direction. Direction, that means if you have higher, if your father has higher education, do you have higher or lower education? So that means the direction of relationship. One can positively affect the independent variable, or the independent can positive or negatively affect the dependent variable. So you need to state it is positive or negative. For example, here, the full picture of your theoretical framework is that father education and mother education are positively correlated. The higher your father education is, the higher your mother education will be. So this is positive. Father education will positively affect expectation on the respondents. By the same token, mother education will have positive effect on the expectation. So the higher expectation will make you pursue more education. So this is also positive. So you need to point out the direction. This is positive or negative in your theoretical framework. So in this case, this is also about the research question and hypothesis. Okay. So once you settle this question, you can form the hypothesis. Then you can go ahead to test the hypothesis. Okay. So unit of analysis. Unit of analysis is what kind of object are you studying? For every research question, you have to specify the unit of analysis of your research. So the unit of analysis referring to the type of unit of researcher used when measuring variables. For example, in qualitative research, we talk about focusing. We try to have theme and unit analysis. Again, unit analysis. So in your research, for example, I want to study divorce. Actually, you can study divorce at different unit of analysis. For example, you want to compare the divorce rate in different countries. So country becomes your unit analysis. But if you want to study divorce behavior in Hong Kong, so you do a survey on the whole Hong Kong population, then individual would be your unit of analysis. You get what I mean? So when we try to comparing different countries, say US, China, Germany, all these countries, then the unit analysis is country. But if you want to study particular country like China, you want to interview people in China, then individual would be your unit of analysis. Okay, got it? So this is your unit analysis. For example, you want to study which school will be more likely have students joining our AD program. Then school is our unit analysis. Okay, if you want to study the gender, whether gender will affect student joining AD, then gender, in this case, gender, this is the research question, but again, individual is our unit analysis. We are asking people, individuals. Okay, so that is the unit of analysis. Common unit analysis in social science are individual, the group, like family, peer group, the organization, like firm and university, or other social categories, like social classes, gender, race. Okay, so in this case, that means we have different types of unit analysis. Okay, so that is the you have you want to learn more. Actually, I have an exercise for you to do in tutorial. Okay, so if you still don't understand because time is very limited in lecture, you can ask your tutor. Okay, but this is quite straightforward. Unit analysis is what objects are you studying? Country, individual, or what else? Or family, something like that. And it also related to research fallacy. Fallacy, that means a fallacy is an error made in reasoning. And in this case, there are many fallacies, but I would like to focus on two types of fallacy. It's related to our unit analysis. So the first one is what we call ecological fallacy. Ecological fallacy, it refers to a proof fit between unit for which a researcher has empirical evidence and the unit for which he or she wants to make a statement. For example, we want to study whether PAM student or SS student or EM student, PLA student, LTM student, which program does better in social research. Okay, so in this case, our unit of analysis is program. Okay, so our unit analysis is program. So we can have a PAM, SS, LTM. For example, AP, we have, because all social research is a compulsory course for all programs. So we have different programs, social work, whatever, okay? So these different programs. So our unit analysis is at program level. This is a little bit quite high, okay? So we say that, for example, just for example. So for example, LTM student has a higher average score than, say, SS student. So this is our finding. After examining the final GPA, whatever, okay? So we find out that LTM has higher average score than SS student. Then we try to selectively, we got one student, for example, student A from LTM. And then we have another student B from SS. And we make the conclusion that B should have lower test with social research score than A, because LTM has higher average score than SS student. So if you make, so this is our finding. So the finding is here. And we say that B should have lower score than A. So this is our conclusion. In this case, we make the fallacy, ecological fallacy. We make the ecological fallacy. So this is wrong. Why? Because they are not referring the same unit. LTM, SS are at the program level. But when we make the conclusion, this is at the individual level. That means we rely on something at the group level, program level, and try to make some guesses, make some prediction at the individual level. This is a kind of ecological fallacy. We cannot do that. Why? Because when we talk about LTM has an high average score, right? So in this case, average score, that means we try to sum them up. Maybe some SS student had very high score. Maybe possibly B has a very high score. But as a whole, the average of SS student has a lower average score than LTM. But it doesn't mean that B has a low score. B can have higher score. By the same token, although A is from LTM and LTM has an average score, but A may have lower score in social research. So when you make the conclusion B has lower score than A, so this conclusion is wrong. Can you get the idea? That means we mix up two units of analysis. This unit analysis is at the program level, at the group level. We make that finding. But our conclusion is at the individual level. This is wrong. We mix up two levels. So this is ecological fallacy. So this is ecological fallacy. Okay? And the other one is the other way around, reductionism. Reductionism is the other way around. We base upon individual lower level of unit analysis and make something about the higher level. Okay? So this is the opposite of ecological fallacy. So in this case, we examine some individual, say B and A. For example, we find out that B has a high score in social research, and A has a high score, a low score in LTM. And we make the conclusion that SS should perform better than LTM. So this is the other way around. This is a kind of reductionism. That is the opposite of ecological fallacy. That means we cannot mix up unit analysis, different level. Okay. Or another one is also about reductionism. For example, we always want to explain everything in terms of psychology, because in our society, individuals are the basic element. So this is why we want to understand the psychology of each individual. Even though we understand the psychology of each individual, we cannot explain something about the society. Okay? Why? Because when we have society, there is something more. The society involves something we call relationship. Individual psychology cannot give rise to relationship. Relationship has to be done at least by two people. Okay, for example, you are very you love yourself very much. Okay, but when we talk about love between two people, you love yourself very much cannot explain two people will love each other. It actually may destroy the love between two people. You know what I mean? So when you try to explain something within group, like two people, by relying on whether the individual love something, so actually this cannot. So that is the kind of reductionism. And sometimes we call it psychological reductionism. We try to use psychology to explain everything at the macro level. That means at the group level, at the societal level. It is wrong. It is a kind of reductionism. Okay, we try to infer something about the group from individual. So that is the fallacy of reductionism. The ecological fallacy is we try to explain something from the group level to the individual level. It's also wrong. Okay, so that is these two, ecological fallacy and the reductionism. Finally, we have tautology. Tautology, it refers to a circular reasoning. That means something is true by definition. So when we argue that someone is poor because he or she has no money, so we are not explaining anything. By definition, poor is having little money. Okay, you got me? So this is a kind of tautology, circular reasoning. Okay, so we try to avoid at least these three fallacies in our research. So make sure that you won't make this kind of mistake in your research proposal. Okay, so any question about these policies or how to formulate research problems and deriving a hypothesis during theoretical framework? Anyone? Okay, so if no, then we will talk more about research next week. So if you do have questions, you can email me, or you especially at the first part, at the beginning part of this lecture, if you don't understand about the scientific inferences, try to review the recording one more time, or try to email me to ask questions. Okay. If no question, then I will end the class. Okay, thank you. Bye bye. Okay, bye bye.